Hey, Josh here, and this is my review of Hunter S. Thompson's The Great Shark Hunt, originally published in 1979. This is going to be a really thick and probably kind of jumbled review because there is a lot to cover in this book. This is an anthology collection of many of his writings, ranging from the mid-1960s all the way up to previous to 1979 when it was published. So this has got a great dearth of stuff in it, and to start off, the book is organized into 4 specific parts, mostly following some kind of thematic evolution, not within the whole book, but within each part, and even some random interlude snippets from other books that he's even written. So I'm going to cover it part by part, and I'll make a final analysis afterwards, whether you should get the book or not. Part 1 starts off with a little closure to the Nixon campaign, flashback style, shows the first couple stories of it, and then flashes forward to the end of it, past what you may have seen in Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72. This is followed by the story The Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved, which is the first Hunter S. Thompson story to be deemed Gonzo, which chronicles his and Ralph Steadman's trip to the Kentucky Derby, and actually is very amusing, definitely worth a read, one of the main headline articles in this book. As well, the next section covers racial issues, relates sports to politics, quite a lot that he would later in his career especially, and a lot about the media and how we poison our stars. As well, he has an epitaph called The Ultimate Freelancer with incredibly powerful writing. It summarizes his view on the downfall of the new wave of writing. He even has a poem called The Collected Telegrams from a Mad Dog, and an excerpt from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, followed by a making-of sorts of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which is pretty interesting, actually, to see the behind-the-scenes bits of it. And there's another story right afterwards that gives more insight into Ralph Steadman, their relationship. It's an interview of Ralph Steadman, and where he talks about Hunter S. Thompson and their collaborations. The main portion of this part, however, is taken up by a story called Strange Rumblings in Aztlan, which expands on Acosta's persona, another example of corrupt politics as well. And if you're not familiar, Oscar Z. Acosta is one of his best friends and is the inspiration for Dr. Gonzo and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, if you're just coming off of that. So this is interesting to read, especially because he's one of the main characters in Hunter S. Thompson's writings, or in many of them. As well, the next one is Freak Power in the Rockies, another headline article, really great to read. It chronicles Hunter S. Thompson's run for sheriff in his hometown of Aspen, and it's hilarious, insightful, great section. There's a memo from the sports desk, the so-called Jesus Freak scare. It's a satirical letter, which is quite amusing. And it finished off with called Memoirs of a Wretched Weekend in Washington, which is very, very good. It's about the Chicago riots destroying peaceful activism and the downfall of society with the election of Nixon. It really follows up Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72. I seem to have really lucked out in the order I've read these books. And it's, like I said, really fantastic writing, very powerful. And that is part 1. Overall, a great introduction. It's traditional Thompson, but it is still really interesting to read. Next up is Part 2, which I don't really have a whole lot to say about, because to me this Part 2 of The Great Shark Hunt is a lot of a rehash and an extended epilogue of Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, much like the beginning of Part 1 was, except a lot more distended and a lot of excerpts from Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail of itself. Basically comes to the conclusion that old politics corrupts new politics. It's like the Cliff Notes version of the downfall of McGovern that he covered in the Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72. They do have full Watergate coverage, which is a little more interesting in here, so you get more of the story. But outside of that, there's not a whole lot new here. Still interesting to read. Fantastic example of his political writings. And if you have read Fear and Loathing Campaign Trail 72, this will definitely interest you as well. Now, Part 3 of The Great Shark Hunt is really where it starts to pick up, for me at least. I find it's the best portion of the book and has a real exotic flavor to it. They have 2 chapters that chronicles the insider-outsider perspective, which carries through to the next portion of the novels, which is the next couple stories, which chronicle Thompson's travels through South America for the National Observer, and chronicles his observations on the relationship between the U.S. and South America, which is amusingly bookended by his own notes to his editor describing his actual trip outside of his journalistic writings, which you can really just see happening along the way. You can really, the disparity between his professional writing and what he's actually thinking is hilarious and a perfect way to end that section. as well as a story called What Lured Hemingway to Catch Him, which is a fantastic piece on how people relate to the age that they are in, and depending on which age they're a product of. It's really sorrowful and really kind of depressing, but also very insightful, so it's definitely worth a read. Even on its own, actually, it's probably one of my favorite pieces within the book. And next up is a story on the dying boomer generation. It's very similar to Kerouac's writings on the death of the Beat generation and On the Road, if you're familiar with that. And the following story is more hopeful, and that just shows that society can adapt to things. And then there's next story following that follows on this general theme, which is again why I like part 3. It seems to have more of a cohesive flow to it. Is that a story on people adapting the wrong way. And overall, some really good writing on the 60s. It's reminiscent of the work in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and the Hells Angels, so it's really great to read, and it kind of harkens back to Hunter in his prime. This is definitely the best portion of the book, and really, really interesting. Goes fast. Goes by really fast, I think. And finally, we come to part 4 of the book, and this starts off with the titular The Great Shark Hunt Story, which is a vastly amusing piece that, while not seeming to say a whole lot, though it does have kind of a bookend at the latter portion of the story that tries to tie it in somewhat to say something, but kind of inconsequential. Regardless, it's a lot of fun to read. It reminds me a lot of The Trip, or at least structure-wise, of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, where they're going on a trip to do something and things get far out of hand, and then they have to get back from it. Which, again, like I said, doesn't have a whole lot to say, but still fantastically entertaining read. And the next couple stories actually cover Jimmy Carter. There's introduction of Jimmy Carter in the '76 campaign, as well as includes one of his notable speeches that Hunter is particularly fond of. There's an informative and emotional, as at least Hunter gets, epitaph for Oscar Giacosta, which is actually the basis for the film Where the Buffalo Roam, starring Bill Murray, if you're not aware of it. And excerpts from Hells Angels, excerpts from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Unfortunately, part 4 is a little excerpt heavy, along with part 2. So there's less that you've read that's new, but at the same time, the excerpts that are included, if you haven't read those books, are fantastic. Definitely the best portions of the books, arguably. And it closes out with actually a large two-piece part on Muhammad Ali and how he was kind of the last great icon of the 60s, in prominence-wise at least. And it's a nice closure out of the book that mainly follows a lot of the What Lured Hemingway to Catch Him, or the change and Beat generation story that I was talking about in part 3, where it deals with more, again, the death of the 60s, which is really when Hunter was at his prime when he was writing about this in the 70s. Overall, The Great Shark Hunt is a fantastic book. I haven't really spoiled a whole lot, don't worry about it. I've told you just the basic synopsis if anyone wants to know. I would have found it helpful before buying it, because frankly, just looking at this huge thing, it's pretty daunting to look at. It's about 600 pages long, so it is a worthwhile investment, and is certainly an investment. But I would recommend picking this up. This wouldn't be the first book I would recommend if you're just getting into Hunter S. Thompson, because it is really disparate, and a lot of the pieces, like I said, are excerpts from other works that will only lend thematically to this book in context if you've read them previously, which is kind of odd the way it's structured. But again, The Great Shark Hunt is a fantastic book, has some great writing in it, some slow portions, but overall the great amount of material that is in here definitely warrants picking it up, because if you're a real Hunter S. Thompson fan, this is a must-own book for at least a couple of the stories that are super famous and always referenced. So pick this one up. This is actually one of my favorite Hunter S. Thompson books. I was not expecting to like it as much as I did, but after Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, it was a nice refresher, and I did enjoy it quite a bit.